So back to India when you were growing up, and just tell us a little bit of, if your hindsight looking back, what was it about those earlier years that enabled you to have this drive for success? What do you think it was?
Now, that was hundreds of years ago. That's the way. But the caste system, in a way, is still important because we always married into caste. And so some of that then gets drilled down.
Many people will have that in different forms of language for them. In the West and in the UK, where I agree with you, there's a different attitude towards work, but I still find that we're not very good generally at reflecting, at taking time out to really understand ourselves. We tend to be very reactive a lot of the time.
And taking the decision wasn't easy. It's not easy to give up, when you have a good salary, when you have a good title, when you have a good lifestyle, to give all that up and start from scratch. And I'm sure you have experienced some of it yourself, Andrew. And
hello, and welcome to Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. In each episode of the show, we hear the insightful confessions of a successful leader who wants to inspire others to live their professional and personal dreams. I am always keen to hear your feedback, particularly in relation to the kinds of leaders you would like me to invite onto the show in future. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the rich insights from our special guest. Hello and welcome to another episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader, hosted by me, Andrew Tallents, the self-coaching expert. I'm delighted that Devyani Vaishampayan has joined me in the studio today, and we're going to have a lovely conversation, I know. But before we get into that, I'd like to say to you, Devyani, just introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about yourself.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invite, Andrew. I'm slightly nervous, but also excited. It's a mixture of emotions because this is, I think, a very different conversation to what I normally talk about and where I feel I'm much more in control. So thank you once again for the reflection I've been forced to do for today. And looking forward to sharing a few things about myself.
Thank you. Well, why don't we start with a little bit about you as a person, so both the professional person and also something about you personally as well.
Okay. So I was born and grew up in Mumbai in India, in what I describe as a typically middle class but educated family. In a family of we have four girls. My father, coincidentally, was also a senior HR director, and I'll come more up to why initially I was very resistant to getting into HR. I did my base degree in physics. So actually, when I was growing up, I was a good student. I was a national scholar. Did very well. I was always in my top 2 or 3 in the class. Got a lot of achievements awards, and my parents were really keen that I become a doctor because in those days in India, if you were bride, it was typically two professions. You either became a doctor or an engineer. And I guess when I passed my A level equivalent, there were quite a few medical entrance exams, but internally I kind of felt I didn't really want to do it, but I was too scared or too hesitant to because I knew how important it was for my parents. And luckily for me, I missed my medical admission by 1 mark. That's a very competitive environment. And internally, I was relieved. But in a way, my parents being quite pragmatic, especially my father, had already thought about plan B for me, which fitted in actually very well with what I wanted to do. And that was first to get a graduate degree in a subject of my choice. So I did my bachelor's in science with physics and electronics as my main degree. And then I immediately went on to do an MBA. So this was about 35 years ago, and an MBA was still relatively new in India. But again, my father was quite visionary, and he understood, I think, that that's a degree that would serve me well. So went on to do my MBA, and then started on a corporate career in India. My first job was with Citibank, which was one of the most blue chip sought after multinationals to work for. And I then went on to join AT&T, where I was the HR director for India. So that, in a nutshell, is my early career and days. And I can then move on to what next, if you want it now, or we can talk about it a bit later.
Yeah, let's do that later on, and it's very normal for when my guests come on to, talk about that early career. And if we're just to fast forward to you now, and obviously you're more mature and more experienced and have learned as well what's important in life, just give us a snapshot of what you do now outside of work and the kinds of interests, hobbies, passions you have outside of work.
Okay. So just to complete my career trajectory then, so that you have a kind of rounded view of what did I do subsequently and what am I doing now. I moved to the UK in 97 because I won the Chevening Scholarship given by the British Council. Now, this was a pretty prestigious scholarship to get because the British Council was going to pay 3 months of both the business school and stay and all associated expenses to do like an advanced management degree. So, as you can imagine, there were thousands of people in India who applied for it. I was one of 12 who got selected. And so at that time, I left my daughter and my husband behind. I forgot to mention in the intervening years. I mean, I know I met my husband when I was first 17. We were at university together and we're still together. And he's been a big factor in where I am today and the support that has been given in spite of probably societal conditions. So I came to the UK in 97, spent 3 months at Leeds Business School. My first exposure to the UK was things like going to the pub there, going for football, and also getting integrated in some of the local activities. And fortunately for me, I think AT&T, which had become Lucent Technologies, felt I could really add a lot of value to their new GSM World headquarters. So I moved out of HR, moved into a marketing strategy role, which was quite unusual in those days for someone in HR to move into marketing. But equally, I had to make a pretty tough decision of coming here first on my own with my daughter, who was 6 at that time. And my husband followed me 8 months later, and he managed to get a try. He was with Shell, he was the marketing director for Shell in India. So he transferred to Shell International at London. So both of us were lucky enough to transfer through our parent companies in India to the UK. And I guess start another phase of my career where I have been in the UK now for the last 26 years. Spent the next 15 years continuing to do senior HR roles in kind of what I describe as big blue chip businesses. So when then I was with the BG Group of British Gas, which where I was Asia Pacific and Middle East HRD. Then went on to become global HR director at Rolls Royce on the marine side of the business. I was with the AET Tankers then, which is a petroleum tankers business, as group HR director. And my last role was at BSI, again as a group HRD. So I would say a 31-year career in HR, in global or international or group HR director roles. And then I did a bit of a sudden, not a sudden, but I did a bit of a turn into becoming an entrepreneur, and that to an AI entrepreneur. Now, I always felt I was entrepreneurial, but of course, I had enjoyed corporate life. But I felt at some stage I want to do it and I want to prove to myself I can do it. And taking the decision wasn't easy. It's not easy to give up, when you have a good salary, when you have a good title, when you have a good lifestyle, to give all that up and start from scratch. And I'm sure you have experienced some of it yourself, Andrew, and understand the pains. I mean, the highs can be high, but equally, the frustrations can be equally painful. Um, so I have done that for about 7 years now. And my first venture was really to set up an angel investment fund. Now, bear in mind, I was not an investment professional. I'd never worked in the finance industry. So again, I think it was quite a bold ambition. And I had to really learn the ropes, right from figuring out regulation, reaching out to people. But I was fortunate enough because my fund invest. So I set up a fund which is still with Cedars, and my fund investors are all FTSE 100 Group HR directors. So I guess people who put their trust in me, had faith in me, and have invested personal money. And the fund has invested in AI-based HR tech startups. So we've done a variety of investments, and now in about over the next 5 to 7 years, we'll be looking at exits. So that was my first experience of being an entrepreneur. And then the second venture I set up has been an AI and digital innovation hub around the future of work. So again, marrying my understanding of how people management and HR functions in large organizations, but equally understanding and sourcing good quality AI solutions. So we've created a virtual marketplace where we have curated a couple of hundred AI digital solutions, but only around the softer aspects of people management. So leadership, culture, engagement, wellness, coaching, mentoring, feedback, DNI. Those are the areas where tech has traditionally never been used. And the whole idea of the hub was really, as its name says, to innovate, to help corporates and HR functions innovate. Because let's face it, and I can say this because I've been an HR professional myself, but HR is not the most innovative. They're not very technology orientated often, but also risk taking comes a little less easily, I think, to HR professionals because if something goes wrong, you have the whole business. It's a backlash from the business, so you have to be careful. And of course, last but not the least, there's always so much to do. I do think I'm empathetic that HR professionals are constantly bombarded with more and more to do. So the idea of the innovation hub was here's a place where we start with what are your people issues, and being HR professionals, our team is made up of HR professionals. So we take it from a user perspective, not from a pure tech perspective. And because we have this whole bunch of technology solutions, AI solutions, we're not tied to any of them. So we look at what's right for you. We'll match you to what you need. And most importantly, we will help you program manage a 3-month pilot. And we will, plan, schedule, help you do that. And the whole idea is at the end of the pilot, you, the client, or you, the HR director or HR manager, is in a much stronger position to figure out firstly, did the solution do what it says? Was it right for you? I mean, very importantly, how have your managers and employees adopted it? And do you want to now take it further and do a full blown rollout? In which case, then we connect the solution provider and the client and we step back. So that and this I set this up at a time 6 years, 7 years ago when AI was not fashionable. Today I think AI has become a bit of a buzzword, but at that time it was really not very understood. And it has given me a lot of pleasure, I think, and a lot of satisfaction to see how to help different corporates and to help them adopt it and to help them get over their hesitation, but also to realize the opportunity that AI can provide. So it has felt very meaningful. I have felt validated about what I thought was going to come, but I've also just concluded a successful exit of the business because that was always the plan that I bring it up to a point where the whole proposition is clear and well developed and then hand it over to someone who can then scale it up even more. So in a way, I've completed the second phase of what I call my career journey, and I've transitioned into what I call as the third phase. And again, it's something, none of this has happened suddenly. It's something I initially thought of, spent some time figuring out, spent some time trying to tinker at it, and then taken the leap. And it's the same with my net portfolio now. I think I first took on my a net role about almost 14 years ago during my exec career. So did my first few with charities alongside my exec career. Then, when I first started my own venture, I was a NED on two what I call as professional, not for profit kind of organizations. I was on the board of the British Quality Foundation and then on the Law Society. But now I've transitioned into what I call as a commercial net portfolio. So I'm currently Remco Chair and NED at two UK listed businesses. The first is Norman Broadbent, which people might be familiar with. It's in the leadership and search space. It's been around for 40 years, but being a listed business, I think, has its own challenges in terms of board governance, and that's really been enjoyable. The second one I took on a year ago, and which is coming to an end, is Saeta, which is again a name listed business, and that manufactures e-drives for e-vehicles. I'm very much an international business in a space I think the UK should be proud of, which is high-end R&D and a lot of patented technology which can be deployed in the automotive sector. But that's just been bought over. And along with that, I'm an independent director at Mazars, which is a tier one audit firm. And just last week has announced a merger with a partnership with a US based firm called Forvis. So, Forvis Mazar, as it's now going to be known, is now one of the global top 10 solution providers or audit firms in that space. Then. So that's my current net portfolio, and the plan going forward is to expand my board portfolio with a couple of roles. But in addition to that, I do a few other things. I'm a board mentor with an organization called Critical Eye, so I mentor CEOs and senior execs, and I've been doing that for the last few years. And recently, about 8 months ago, I've been made a fellow of Chapter Zero, which is an organization that focuses on climate and board directors. So, in a way, for me, and I think you've seen the trend now, I get into something and then there comes a point of time where I feel I have to get into something new and invest a lot of my time and energy in upskilling myself and learning about that. So I did that with HR, I did that with group exec roles, I did that with AI and being an entrepreneur. And now for me, it's being a commercial net, but also the climate agenda, which is taking up a lot of my, which is a big part of my interest now.
Well, thank you for that run through, Devyani. And I think it'd be lovely to go back now so the audience can connect with where all this came from, all this life that you've been living around various forms of success. So back to India when you were growing up, and just tell us a little bit of, if your hindsight looking back, what was it about those earlier years that enabled you to have this drive for success? What do you think it was?
It's I don't know. And if I would have looked at my younger self, I would have been absolutely amazed at what I'm doing now, just because it was really outside the realm of anything that I was looking at or people in my network would going abroad. I'd never been abroad, so even that was like a dream at that time. Working there and becoming successful was completely out of question. So in a way, I think it's a combination of being born in the right family, being lucky with opportunities, and really I believe in God's grace quite a bit, and having that to take things forward. But to begin with my family, I do think the biggest influence on me has been my parents. I mentioned I grew in a pretty economically middle class family, but both my parents were very, I think, strong in a few values. I mean, we weren't poor, by the way. If I give you the impression, I think we were relatively, by India standards, we were good, but it was very much, not a flashy, very frugal environment. And the emphasis was very much on education. So my father worked, my mother was a housewife, but most of the earnings we were four girls. I come from a family of siblings. We were four of us, all girls. Probably the numbers would have been smaller if a boy would have been born earlier. So my parents kept on trying for a boy and then stopped at four. But in spite of, and I say that because in those days, probably spending or getting girls educated wasn't such a big priority. And yet, even though there were four of us, my parents have ensured that all of us have been educated very highly. And it's not just, spending the money. I think it's pushing us. We all do things that we think are going to make, especially when you're young, that's going to make our parents proud. And the biggest thing for us was academic achievement. If it was drilled into us that we had to be academically really, really strong and put all our efforts into it. And I think, in a way, the work ethic, therefore, that I have today is also completely due to them. So the two things that they have given me a lot is the quest for learning and the work ethic, because they demonstrated that all the time. But equally, I think being born a girl in Indian society at that time meant there were a lot of other expectations. It was really important that I was firstly, domestically, I was good at things. I mean, it would not have been okay that, oh, you just study and you do well in academics, but it was equally important that I learn how to manage the house, cook, look after guests. And I actually am very thankful that, because it has meant that you have to learn how to multitask. It has meant that I've helped create, when I brought up my family, it's been, a happy family, because all these things are important too. When you're at home, good food is important. Being looked after well is important. And those have come then naturally to me because I was trained to do that. And the other thing that was a big part of growing up for me was spiritual, the spiritual kind of focus. Now, again, I have to give a little context here. You've heard about the caste system in India, and just for those who are not familiar, I mean, broadly speaking, there are four castes. You have the Brahmins, who are considered to be at the top of the tree and are considered to be the intellectuals or the educated ones. Then you have the soldiers, who are considered the warriors. Then you have the business people, and then you have people who kind of do more of the menial jobs. Now, that was hundreds of years ago. That's the way. But the caste system, in a way, is still important because we always married into caste, and so some of that then gets drilled down. And I think because of that, the two things that have probably genetically in me is the education learning, because I'm a Brahmin. But also, I think the other is the spiritual focus, because Brahmins typically were the ones who were the kings. They looked after the gods and the spiritual aspect of things, but they were considered very learned in that sense. So for me, I think I have always, well, obviously, I've done about maybe 5% or 10% of what my parents used to do at home. But the one thing I've been good at is I've never given it up, and I have my own personal prayer time. And there came a time, actually in my early 30s, when I took 6 months off to really go to India and train to be a Hindu priest, because I knew the rituals, but I didn't know enough about why it was being done, what is behind it, and why is it so important. And so it was again to understand and make it more relevant, not just do it because you're expected to do things. So I do think that's another aspect of my life. Family and spirituality are two other aspects of my life that have always been important and have played a big part along the journey, whichever part of the journey it's been.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that landscape that you've created there in terms of the life that you had when you were growing up, and indeed expectations, around that as well. So what I'm really interested in, I'm sure the audience is as well, Devyani, is to understand that at some point during your career, and I've succumbed to this as well, even though we have hard work ethics, we sometimes work ourselves into the ground, and other people expect it as well. So just tell us about a time in your career where actually you realized that some of those earlier strengths that you had from your environment of growing up weren't maybe serving you as well as maybe they could have been.
Yeah, so I think in a way the big when I started work, the first 10 years were in India. And in a way, it for me, I was relatively junior then or younger then. But also the work environment, I had also more like-minded people. So I didn't feel much dissonance. But when I came to the UK in 97, I realized there was quite a big gap between, or a change in, particularly at I was middle management then, or middle to senior management then, and the workforce and people's attitudes and what was important. And I had to then really look at myself in a very different way. So what thought was a strength, where I'm very hard on myself, and I also tend to drive people hard, um, actually was a liability, because it's good. I think people here have a more relaxed attitude towards work. It's important, but that's not your whole life. There are other things that are important. So Whereas in India, it's slightly different. People who are there, it becomes really competitive, and everyone is like go go go. So I had to step back and really take a good look at both myself, but also in terms of leadership style. Managing a team, I had to do things differently. I think the second thing I had to readjust to was India was still a very hierarchical place, and so because of your position, automatically you kind of had power or you had influence. Whereas here, I think I had to learn how to influence based on not my title and not my role, but who I am, and that meant learning to operate a little differently. So I think learning how to influence was probably something I learned to do once I came to the UK rather than being in India, where it was a little more came automatically because you were someone in that role. And then, of course, the third thing for me was being a woman, but also not just being a woman. I hadn't grown up in the UK, so you know the things that you relate to, the famous TV or film personalities, or the banter, or the jokes, or going to the pub, or I had to really learn and adapt to be slightly different, because ultimately it was important for me to fit in, uh, and be a part of the team. Um, I also surprisingly at that time I found, unlike India, I felt there were less women in leadership, in senior leadership teams that I was part of. And so from the time I think I came to the UK, I even though and it's HR where you've in the past you always see more women in HR as compared to, let's say, some other functions. But when I was at BG, and I was part of the senior HR leadership team with the global head and then the regional heads. I was the only woman, and after that, most of the time I have been a single woman. It's changing now, and I say so. The combination of being a woman, I guess ethnically being different, but most importantly, not having grown up in this country, has meant that I've had to put in a lot more effort in understanding things, in adapting myself, uh, and being a little more paying more attention than perhaps if I was born and brought up here.
Thank you. And I'm particularly interested in something you talked about there about the spirituality side. And many people will have that in different forms of language for them, what it means to them. But I understand what you mean. I think there are many people even here in the West and in the UK where I agree with you. There's a different attitude towards work, but I still find that we're not very good generally at reflecting, at taking time out to really understand ourselves. We tend to be very reactive a lot of the time. So I'm interested in learning, when you took that time out to go back to India and find that piece of you and reconnect to it, how did it change how you approached your life when you came back?
So I think it did two things. Firstly, meditation is not something I had taken to earlier, because I'm more of a high energy action person. And so, even though meditation is there, and I conceptually understood it to be important, it was difficult for me to do it. But I think having done that, as you said, it's a big part of taking the time to step back, reflect, go into yourself. And so that's something I accepted and understood, and therefore learned to do more of it after that. The other thing is, in a way, it didn't change what I was doing. So, in a way, I don't do that much, but once a week, I do set aside 1.5 hours for my prayer, my ritual, and reading a few things. But I think it did. So, I continued doing that, but I think it changed the way I saw the value of what I was doing and the meaning it was giving to me. Whereas earlier it was more a case of I need to do it, I'm supposed to be doing it, and I'll feel really guilty if I don't do it. But I think the approach towards it is very different now.
Absolutely. And the follow-up question then, and it may have been that this wasn't apparent at the time, but sometimes when you do that, and even though you're taking time out to do it, and it doesn't always change the way you do things. It changes the reason why you do things. But did you have any feedback from people around you that you seemed different in some way once you'd come back from that journey?
Not really, because I think the only people who have seen me closely, I knew about that was my family, my girls, my husband.
Mm.
Um, and in a way, they have seen me, they see me all the time. So I don't think that per se,
Mm.
but they also know how important it is to me. And I think for me, you know, the fact that I have never forced them around this, but they've adopted some of it is, in a way, their feedback to me to say, yes, I think this is important. And probably it's helped me and it's going to help them. On this topic, I also feel, I think in terms of management or leadership, I think there's now the awareness that it's not just IQ, but it's EQ that is important. I also think actually there's an SQ, the spiritual quotient, which it shouldn't have to be linked to religion. I think every religion ultimately says the same thing. It's the practices associated with it, which again I think make for a more well-rounded leader, especially in today's environment where empathy, understanding, compassion is getting to be more important. I think just having a higher SQ can lead you to do that.
I agree, and I think it's more acceptable to talk about it in Western organizations now as well, without being seen to be either weak or something that is something we can't talk about. And I heard something very recently, which I loved, and I'm sure you relate to this in terms of the spirituality side, that whether it's at work or at home, once we start to look inwards and we have that time and presence to be, as you said, in being, what it enables us to do is be present more of the time. But also, some people interpret that as this unconditional love, if you like, with self and with others, which is equivalent to presence. And I think that how it impacts leadership in terms of authenticity and presence. So I really appreciate you bringing that up and sharing it with the audience. I think more people should explore that. We are coming towards the end of our time together, but there's a couple of questions I still want to ask you, Devyani. And the first is, you've been on a very interesting journey from one culture into a very different culture, very well educated, but you've also taken risks in terms of changing careers. So if there are people out there in the audience that are listening to this or watching this now, what advice would you give to them if there's something burning within them that says, okay, I'm happy in what I'm doing, or there's something out there for me still, and yet it seems quite difficult or risky, or I'm not sure? What kind of advice would you give them?
Well, firstly, I think as you've touched on, it's good if people start thinking there's something out there and know what it is, because the most difficult thing is to figure out what is it. I think a lot of people kind of sense they're not very happy, but then it's difficult to figure out what is going to make you happy. And that does need a little bit of quiet time. It needs trying out different things. It needs interacting with a wide variety of people. I mean, that's really important, because the more you're talking to different people, interacting with very different ranges of people, I think that also helps you understand what's possible and what could you be good for. Uh, the question of then what to do with it, I think, is a very personal one. It's linked very much to your own sense of risk, but also your circumstances. I think financials are very important. I'm a very pragmatic person, so I would never for a second say, "Oh, forget that. The money will come." I think you do need to think about what money do you need. How much of financial security is important, and then figure out what's the right step for you and when. I have to share again that when I started my entrepreneurial venture, I mean, I was 53, so it was like, okay, all my big financial obligations are done. We should be okay, at least in terms of having a roof on our head or being able to eat. But I think it's very difficult mentally to readjust when you've been used to earning an X amount, and then it really comes down to a fraction of what it was. It's not about whether you need it, but the idea, at least I found, I was surprised at how strongly my sense of well being was linked to the concept that I was earning so much. So so my key advice is, again, get excited, explore, take a risk, but also make sure financially you've thought through things carefully.
One final question for you.
Mhm.
Really gain your insight on this because of your passion for India as well, and where you were growing up. If you were to look at India now and a teenage girl growing up now, maybe 11 or 12 years old, compared to you as an 11, 12-year-old, how would you compare and contrast the opportunities now that are there for that 12-year-old in India today?
Oh, I think there's a huge change happening in India. Huge. I mean, I think the societal change is really, and it's happening, I think, the most for women. On one hand, I mean, the kind, we were very constrained at that time about around what would people say. Reputation was extremely important. It's like I was, I mean, I had boys in my class, I had boys at university, and I could, but the idea of having a boyfriend at that time was unimaginable. It would have sparked off a lot of I mean, the fact that I met my husband at university and did have a boyfriend, and he was actually the same caste, he was well educated, he came from the kind of family they would have gone to. But the fact that I did it without their permission or without them leading on it led to a fair amount of tension and conflict initially. So it was a very restrictive society, whereas today girls are really, really, there's a lot more freedom. When I say freedom, they're not judged at, the way girls were judged at that time. They're absolutely not judged in terms the the emphasis on having a job, having a career has now extended to large sections of the society. I also think, however, conversely, and that's happening in all societies across the world, where social media is putting a lot more pressure, unhealthy pressure, on how you look, how you dress. So the emphasis on the external aspects of being a woman, being a girl, are now getting to be, which I'm so thankful we didn't have to go through. So definitely a much easier place, definitely a more relaxed, condoning environment for a girl to be in. But fundamentally, I still think attitudes have still not changed completely, and it's a journey. And so I think, again, similar to here, where men still think being a woman should be X, Y, Z. Some of that needs to, but I think overall, I would say a lot of change for the better, definitely.
Excellent. We've come towards the end of our time, so I really wanted to say, Devyani, thank you very much for joining us on the show today. I know that all the audience out there that have listened to this and are watching this now, they would have taken things away that they can think about, particularly in terms of this internal reflection. They have choices, but we have to take time out to do that. And that if the conditions are right and we're prepared to take the risk, then we can change our lives. So thank you for those lovely messages, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. And I have to say, I've said things that I haven't thought about for a long time. So I hope it comes out right, but thank you.
Thanks very much. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Confessions of a Successful Leader. You can access all previous episodes of the show at confessionsofaSuccessfulLeader.com. If you are interested in finding out more about conscious leadership and self-coaching, just type in Andrew Tallents into LinkedIn or your favorite browser, and you'll find my contact details and all the content that you need. Until next time, don't forget to stay present, curious, and above all, conscious.